Welcome back to another edition of the Slipstream Podcast. We just did our first live watch along on Twitch. So we look to do a few more of those as we go through the rest of the Formula One season. So feel free to check us out on Twitch at the Slipstream Podcast or at Slipstream Podcast. So we're coming to you right after the race, which is a little bit of a rarity and change of pace for us. So right off the back of the last lap, and Max Verstappen, fastest lap on the last lap. So yeah, overall, not a super crazy race. A little bit of drama with one safety car due to Lance Stroll, but still, Red Bull back-to-back 1-2. Is anything going to stop them this season, or is this just going to be every race from here on out?
Well, when we talked about it earlier, when we did the preview, like the question was, will they win every race? And I said, well, you know, it's like they would have to get lucky, or really they would have to not get unlucky. And I was already kind of worried about eating my words in qualifying yesterday when Max had a drive rod issue. So he started 15th and was able to rebound and get second. Safety car probably helped, but wasn't the only reason. But no, I mean, this is the first time we saw their true pace for most of the race, right? I think they were told to manage at about 40, 41 because Alonso was already 16, 17 seconds behind. They were pulling a second a lap on everyone trying to race each other, but they are definitely in a league of their own right now. So we'll see if the development war kind of brings them a little bit closer to the rest of the field here in a little while.
Yeah, I know that, Stin, when you and I did the preview show, I was somewhat bullish on Ferrari having a chance, being a very different track. Saudi Arabia being a very different track than Bahrain, but it turns out that pretty much the same story as last week, and Ferrari was nowhere near the pace. So, Matt, I don't know, where do you think this leaves Ferrari right now? I mean, they were, 6th and 7th and didn't really even push the Mercedes this week.
Well, they did have a good pit strategy for once, so we can applaud them for that. But I don't know. I mean, everybody's fighting for second, third, and fourth. I mean, at this point between those three, nobody's keeping up with Red Bull. I don't know where we see them go. I mean, they had the DNF with Charles last week, but I was kind of shocked that Charles only kind of made up 4 or 5 spots from where he started. He never really pushed up to the top tier guys in a track that he was phenomenal at last year, barely losing out to Max. You asked me where they go. I don't think they go anywhere. I mean, I think they're where they're at. They're going to be second, third, or fourth. I mean, I know they have more wind tunnel time than Red Bull, but it's not going to matter. You just try to keep upgrading that car, and your battle is with Aston and Mercedes, and you do your best to try to push through that. I really don't know what they can do at this point to compete for race wins. Nobody's going to compete for race wins, it doesn't look like at this point, besides Max and Checo trading them off.
Matt, you had said that Ferrari has more wind tunnel time than Red Bull, and while we've been saying that a lot, when Brady and I were previewing this race, I kind of had an epiphany saying that, well, if you have a lot of cars that are all developing like Red Bull does, Red Bull is able to visually look at other cars and copy external components.
Yeah.
So like Ferrari and Mercedes are very different. And then you're starting to see a lot of the rest of the grid move towards that Red Bull. I mean, there's been plenty of jokes now about you've got like the Red Bull one team and you've got the green Red Bull. So like as cars start developing their car for them, it's gonna help them still.
And the other thing, I mean, they have less wind tunnel time because of finishing first and then the cap cost penalty. They got better. Now maybe it affects them over the course of the year, maybe. And I'll go to say this, and it's not a dig at any other constructor, but in my opinion, it does not matter how much wind tunnel time you have if you do not have the right people to analyze the information. And Red Bull has the best of the best. Like you could give HAAS the most wind tunnel time, triple it, quadruple it, but you stick us in there trying to figure out the car, right? It's not going to matter. right? I know those guys are better that are there, but Red Bull already had this huge of a gap going into the season because of last year, and they got everything right going into the new regulations. That wind tunnel decrease doesn't affect them. Not only does it not decrease them because they're just so far ahead, they have the ability to try new things that other teams can't. It's a whole lot easier to get your car better when you're already great to an extent, right? Because these other teams are having to use it to try to catch up. But Red Bull doesn't have to do anything to catch up. They're already well above what everybody else is, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that a little bit on the preview show, is that, the one thing that I think everyone forgets is that Red Bull obviously had the best car last year, right? So they were starting 2023, in a better position than anybody else already, right? So they didn't have to do a whole lot of development to already have the fastest car. Now the question will ultimately be who, if anyone, can catch up, right? And I think, Sten, you might know this, and you mentioned this with the green Red Bull. Aston hired a few Red Bull people, didn't they? And so I think part of that conversation that Alonso said recently around, someone like Lawrence Stroll has the means and the want to hire the right people to build a race team. And so he took some quality, development personnel from Red Bull who obviously knew how they designed their car, and you could see that it's panned out for them. So I think, Matt, that's a great point about having the right people analyze it and know what they're doing. And, just to stick on Aston for a second, a lot of our preview show was about, is Aston legit, or was Bahrain just a good track for them? And, I still don't know. I know Alonso's gotten 2 podiums, which is incredible, but he didn't pull away from the Mercedes other than, the 5 seconds there at the end with George and 5 more seconds over Lewis. So there is still a part of me that thinks if anyone's going to be able to catch up to Aston and pass them, it's going to be Mercedes. But good for them. I don't think anyone saw Fernando getting back-to-back podiums to start this season.
No, and going back to the point that you had made, just about development and whatnot. Like, again, Red Bull did lose some of their engineers to Aston Martin, and it's hard to lose engineers. But what if it was, update, correction, 10-second time penalty for Alonso for serving the penalty incorrectly. So update to the podium standing. George podium.
Wow.
Yeah, live, real time. You hear it first here. But, Red Bull might have dumped, they went over budget in 2021. They might have put a lot of their budget into the team to develop the car, to then release some of those people and now spend more money on building the car, because I think they already got a patent or some type of plan approved in 2022 for the new monocoque that was like 10 or 15 kilos lighter, but it would have cost millions of dollars to introduce. So they might have just not had, not renewed extra contracts just to free up some more capital now that they've gotten the most that they could out of those support roles, not under, Adrian now.
The Alonso breaking news is interesting because I was about to say that this was Alonso's 100th podium in his career, but I guess he stays on 99 for another week or two. That's crazy, though. That penalty, it was clear the first violation. Austin, I know when we were watching it live, you called it that he was on the left side of his grid box. And it's the very similar situation to Ocon last week. You got a 5-second penalty for an incorrect starting position, and then didn't serve the penalty correctly, and ultimately cost him 10 more seconds in a podium.
It'll be interesting for Aston when isn't it July 1st when the wind tunnel time corrects itself based on current standings? And what are they capable of doing? Or do they start to decrease once after that July 1st? Are they going to be able to keep up with what they're doing and what their upgrades were able to put them in a better spot, or less wind tunnel time? Because as of right now, they would have the second least amount. What are they capable of when they don't have more than everybody else in the top?
Yeah, I don't know. That's where, I'm still hesitant. If you look at the standings, and I guess it's going to change a little bit now with the Alonso update, but Right now, that puts Mercedes in P2. Now, you can look at it a couple different ways. They're still 50 points behind Red Bull, or almost 50 points behind Red Bull after 2 weeks. So I don't think anyone's catching Red Bull, no matter what development happens. And, so far, I mean, other than Red Bull, Mercedes hasn't had any, DNFs yet. Ferrari has had one in week 1 with Charles, and then now Aston has one with Lance here in Saudi Arabia. So, one of the best attributes of Mercedes is that they seem to have fewer reliability issues than anybody else. That doesn't mean that they won't. And they've started to talk a big game around how they had a long meeting at the factory, and they all agree that they're going to go in this different direction, whatever that means. And now they're all in on this development of this whatever new looking car. But from wind tunnel to track, I don't know how long that takes. I would imagine it takes a couple of races, or a couple of months, 6, 7, 8 races, and by that point they'll be 100 or 200 points behind Red Bull. So, I don't know. I was happy for Alonso. I still think he's going to have a good season. I think they've got a great car, but I still don't see them as number 2 yet.
Well, you said that Mercedes doesn't have much reliability issues, yet Stroll, who has Mercedes doesn't have reliability issues. That Stroll has a Mercedes engine in that broke down today, so there is some type of reliability issue. But
Lando
we don't know
already
if that's...
had a change of Mercedes engine as well.
So
sure. So I mean, those are all valid points. I just mean it didn't hit them.
Yeah,
right?
the works game.
So maybe there's other parts that go into that, but we'll see. And I know it's only 2 races, but so far they haven't had a DNF, so we'll see what happens.
And speaking of, you're saying how long does it take to go from wind tunnel to track? I don't know, but if they've started this week, right? There's 2 more weeks until the next race. I mean, there's 6 weeks before we get to 2 races after now. So if it's within a 4 to 6 weeks, they may have that upgrade coming into what is that race, right? That was supposed to be after China. I can't think off the top of my head right
I think
now,
it's Baku, right?
Or
It's
Baku.
Imola and then
it's
Baku,
Baku.
I think.
I mean, how long was winter break?
3 months.
Yeah, I mean, winter breaks. It's basically a spring break is what they're getting because of the China race being canceled.
Yeah, you'll have 2 races over 5 weeks and 3 races over 9 weeks. That feels close. Like that's a big chunk of change. If you realized at Bahrain preseason testing, you have 10 weeks to roll out for your 4th race. Like that's a substantial chunk of time to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that absolutely helps. And maybe someone, if it's Mercedes or someone else, will use that to their advantage. And, they talked, I think it was Toto or whoever said it, but that they feel like with this commitment to this new direction that they didn't take 1 step forward or 1 step back to take 2 steps forward. He said it's definitely been 2 steps forward, at least in the wind tunnel. But I would imagine that they thought this current concept was great in the wind tunnel too. Otherwise they wouldn't have stuck with it. So, who knows? But I will say this. I mean, Mercedes finishing 3rd and 5th today. I don't think anyone really saw that happening. I didn't.
I don't think I didn't see it happening. Like that wasn't as far-fetched this time last year for them to finish 3rd and 5th. Because again, a down year for them is not winning races. Like that is just what a down year is. So last year was kind of a down year, but like it really wasn't. But I will agree that I expected Ferrari still to be more competitive collectively than both Mercedes, and they weren't.
I mean, we talked about it in the watch along, like kind of right when it came on. We didn't think, now obviously there's a technicality or a penalty here, but we didn't think George was going to get a podium. Now he had to have a little bit of luck on his side to get there. But even from his starting spot, we didn't think that it was going to be able to happen. And, one way or the other, he found his way there. And 3rd and 5th here is better than they did last year, especially Lewis. Wasn't this the race where Lewis asked if he got a point for finishing 10th or whatever?
10th,
like
yeah,
that?
He didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was knocked out in Q1, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was like his streak or whatever of getting out or whatnot ended. It's a win for Mercedes this weekend, at least in my opinion.
So here's a question. Do we think that Mercedes would have fallen into the default podium after the Alonso penalty if Stroll didn't DNF?
I was going to bring that up because I think at the beginning of the race, I had said, man, George is going to get swallowed up at the start. And he really didn't. Obviously, Alonso, we didn't talk about this, but Alonso got the jump on Checo, led for the first couple of laps. Then, that speed of the Red Bull just was too much. But George was hanging on there for a little while with, I think, Lance and Carlos behind him until the safety car. And was just kind of there the whole race until Max obviously made his way through and, got up into the top two positions. And so, for however many laps, it was George and Lewis in fourth and fifth. And we thought that's where they ended up until this new penalty. So, yeah, I do want to talk about the safety car for a second. Obviously Max, the talk of qualifying was Max's issue. Ultimately, it happened in Q2, so he started 15th. And, he has won a race from 14th before. So I think a lot of us thought that he'd still find a way to win from 15th. But early in the race, Checo had what, Stin, do you remember, a 21-second lead over Max as Max worked his way through the field?
As he was fourth at that point, right?
Yeah. And then a couple guys pit, right? Charles pit. Did Sergio pit? A few guys pit a lap or two before the safety car. So sort of out of nowhere on lap around 20, there was an issue with Lance Stroll, and he pulled off on that long sort of banked turn.
Yeah.
And the safety car came out pretty quickly, and we talked about this as we watched it live. His car was out of the way. They needed to push it like 3 feet for it to completely be off the track. But yet they still threw out a safety car, and they talked about on the broadcast how I guess there was a GPS issue, and it looked like he was still on track. And, for all intents and purposes, I get safety first, but it probably should have been a virtual safety car. But that helped, Max probably as much as anybody because he restarted in P4. And we kind of all thought, well, he was 21 seconds behind Checo, and now he's 2, and he would eventually get this way to first, and it never happened.
Yeah, he was able to. So Checo, Alonso, George, Max were all able to take a free pit stop and not lose position on track. Stroll pit early from a dummy call by Ferrari. Ferrari was able to go long with Sainz and overcut Stroll with that on track. And then right after that pit cycle happened with those two front runners, you had the safety car come out. And that's where Lewis got a free pit and got ahead of Leclerc as well. So Lewis was able to benefit from that pit cycle. And yeah, everyone ahead of, Lewis and forward didn't lose any positions. But some people that had already pit were a little bit on the back foot then. But Lewis coming out on hards and having to, finish the race on mediums and kind of being that alternate strategy, you were concerned that he might not be able to make it, or he's already complaining about his tires on the hards. Is he going to keep complaining about the tires now? But he didn't really ever put the mediums to use and run George down.
He got close to him there for a few laps, to the point where we thought that they were going to almost let him go just so that his tires wouldn't get eaten up so that he could last the race. And then he ended up just dropping off completely. Within 2 laps after getting within half a second, he was down 2.5 seconds. The mediums either died off, or I don't know if they made a call and said just to back off. You're not going to catch Alonso anyway. But I'm sure he would have liked to have been able to get through, considering the fact that Alonso's penalty got George onto the podium.
Well, I also think this is fascinating. This happens every week, and I know we've talked about this before, and we talked about it while we watched the race. Carlos and Charles were on 2 different tires, right? Carlos started on mediums and Charles on softs, but then Carlos pits before Charles. It's like, Why didn't you just use softs? And I'm sure there was something to happen in the race and timing to get him in and out or whatever changes that. But it's just weird. I mean, I think Charles made his softs go 20 laps. And so, yeah, Lewis being on the hards, that safety car certainly didn't help his overall strategy, but it still seems like he would have been a sitting duck no matter what if he had been on those hards for 35 laps. So just kind of a weird way that it played out. But I do have a question. I feel like we talk about this every season. Why does it take the FIA so long to announce penalties? I mean, when did Fernando pit on lap 20? So he had 30 laps in the race.
It was during the safety car. Yeah.
Right. So we come to find out the last lap or two that he might have another 5-second penalty, and George was trying to get within that 5-second window, and he doesn't. And then it comes out that shortly after the race, he did the same thing, or his team did the same thing as Ocon did last week or 2 weeks ago, and didn't correctly serve the 5-second penalty. So he ultimately gets a 10-second penalty. And how did they not announce this earlier? I mean, I don't know if it would have changed anything, but Lewis ultimately is going to finish, 0.3 seconds behind Fernando? If he had known the 10-second penalty was there for however many more laps, could he have made up 0.3 seconds? I don't know.
And again, it was during a safety car. So, go to 6 seconds. You're not losing time on track. You might have lost out to George. Maybe. I think there was probably a 3 or 4 second offset between them after they came out of the pit cycle. But Max was another 15 seconds behind or something. Just wait another 2 or 3 seconds just for safety. I'm very interested to see that, there's got to be some massive team briefing from all the teams saying, hey, here's the rule. You can't touch this damn car until we tell you to. Don't let any part of you or any of our equipment touch the vehicle. And I guess they said that they thought that the rear jack was already staged. Even though it didn't lift, it was already staged. When Ocon last race, they had it wasn't just that a tool was touching it. They started detaching the front wing because he had a wing damage. During the time, it's oh, we can't change our tires. No, you can't touch your damn car. The entire time, don't touch your car. Don't touch it. It's like telling my kids, stop touching each other. Don't touch each other. Stop. You can't touch it for 5 seconds. Don't do it. And it costs you an extra 10 more.
Yeah, there's a tweet from Will Buxton a few minutes ago that says, if the FIA is going to penalize teams for doing their own timings on when their car stops and when their crew get to work, they need to install their own timers on the pit entries so there can be no debate. 2 penalties in 2 races doesn't reflect well on the process.
No.
So, yeah, it's just crazy to me that I don't know if we've really seen these penalties often, starting with the grid, lining up in the wrong position and then ultimately messing up. But we're 2 for 2 this season. This is bizarre.
I love that there's a picture going around online already too, that George Russell was given his trophy from Alonso for 3rd place.
Really?
Yeah. Well, Alonso didn't give it to him. It was probably a handler. But yeah, George is seen in the paddock holding a Monster Energy water bottle and the 3rd place podium.
I mean, they did they had already gone through the whole ceremony and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable that
it makes no sense.
No. So I guess my question is that, are they just not paying attention and Mercedes tipped them off to this? I don't get how, if that is why there's somebody almost not stationed from the FIA, within 2 paddocks or whatever, that can go and sit there and clock, or how are you not realizing this 35 laps later? It doesn't, not only is it a process with them, and then just how are you just that fucking dumb, in Aston it already happened once last week. It's how are you not, like you said, how are you just not more cautious? How are you just that oblivious? And those points matter between those 2 teams. They matter tremendously, and they can matter a lot or this next season, and it would be hilarious if they're within like 3 points of each other going into like the last race, and it's all
because it's
they
a
touched the
6-point
car
swing.
too soon. Yeah, I mean, like it's big. It's a lot of points.
Yeah.
I mean, if you consider it.
Yeah, it's okay. Alonso lost 3 points, but George gained 3 points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like and I know that a race is won by sometimes thousandths of seconds, but taking a risk for a tenth or two isn't worth risking 10 seconds.
Especially not, like you said, like under safety car, like where half a second doesn't truly matter.
No. And if you look at the data that at least we have from the first 2 races, Red Bull is 1 second a lap ahead of everyone. Alonso is 0.3 of a second ahead of everyone else. So like they have a little bit more pace in hand to be able to deal with waiting another second. Like, right, that's 3, 4, maybe 5 laps. I know you don't want to intentionally put your driver out where he's having to overtake someone again on track, but it's top of mind for us, and it should be top of mind for the teams because we saw what happened in the last race. Just err on the side of caution.
I would love to be in Aston's sort of paddock right now, see if Fernando's pretty pissed that this happened. Because it's not, well, the first penalty is his fault, right? So cause and effect. If he doesn't mess up this first time in a starting position, this never happens. But, once he had that 5-second penalty and served it incorrectly, same with Ocon 2 weeks ago, that part wasn't their fault. But, for me, just going back to the FIA taking so long, it's just a snowball effect on, we saw Max save up for a lap or two to hammer to get the fastest lap on the last lap. So if you add 10 seconds to Fernando's time, he would have beaten Lewis by 0.4. So you're telling me, had that not been made known 10 laps earlier, that Lewis might have, and maybe Alonso would have pushed harder too, and maybe it wouldn't have mattered. But it just I would just like to see those things cleaned up so that you kind of know the situation as you cross the checkered flag, not finding out afterwards. That's always a weird thing to happen sometimes in Formula One.
That's how Sainz got his first podium. Do you guys remember that?
I do remember that. I forget the penalty, but I do remember that.
So it was back in 2019. And that's when Albon was slated for his first podium ever in Brazil at Interlagos. And Lewis kind of took him out. Lewis got penalized. Alonso spun out. And Gasly, I think, was it Gasly? Who was drag racing Lewis to end up getting second on track. Lewis had like a hanging end plate, and then Lewis was penalized 5 seconds after the race, after the podium celebration, and Sainz hung around, and then like the entire team was below where like the podium celebrations were and took a photo like 6 hours after the podium celebration happened. Could you imagine if Alonso was in the driver's press conference, like the post-race press conference, and they're like, excuse me, George, will you take Alonso's seat? Like, that would be terrible.
Excuse me, Fernando, how do you feel about P4 today? Excuse me, what? P4?
We found out Max, we knew he was going to win, but we found out Max won the championship last year after, like in Japan, like 15 minutes after the race was already over.
After the commentators had spent 2.5 hours prepping us for we don't receive full points. And it was an asterisk within the rules saying that if the race doesn't finish under, like if it doesn't finish because of a red flag, then no. But because it came from red flag and started, it just went to time. Like there's a lot of things that as F1 is getting much larger in the States and everywhere else, and they're trying to build this massive fan base, like you have to have your stuff so buttoned up and polished and understand your own rules. And if you can't do that, like at no point ever would you think that the Super Bowl this year would have been decided after and they would have retroactively changed who won or who didn't. Like, oh, the field goal, I don't know. Like, no, you stop what's going on and you review it.
Well, I think the best analogy that we might be able to make, and I'm the soccer guy here, is stoppage time, right? So when the World Cup happens, people who don't watch soccer for 4 years, they watch a soccer match or football, wherever you are in the world. And when stoppage time happens, they're like, what is this thing called stoppage time? It's kind of the same thing because you feel like the game should be over at 90 minutes, right? And it's just not. There's sort of this ambiguous amount of time that's left. But if you watch soccer all the time, you're used to it, you understand it. It's kind of the same way with Formula One in a way. Even if you watch it all the time, you kind of understand how these things can happen, but you wouldn't want it to happen, right? You kind of want these things to be over as the checkered flag waves. And, I guess bizarre things can happen. Who was it? Seb, who had not enough fuel in his tank a couple years ago and got DQ'd, even though he was second or third in that race. So I get it. Motor racing is definitely different, but it is kind of a bizarre thing to have happen, right?
For a multi-billion-dollar league.
Yep. To shift gears quickly, kudos to Checo for leading all 50 laps. He almost had the Grand Slam until Max decided to shit on him on the last lap. There was a bit of I know, Sten, you like to listen to the Red Bull's radios, and they were managing certain pace, and there was a radio call where Checo was told to hit 133 flats, and then Max is a 132.6. And Checo's like, well, why did you tell me to do 33? So we all thought Max was coming, and he ultimately didn't. And he talked about a little bit of an issue, maybe some high speed over the last couple of laps. But Max certainly saved up some battery for the last lap and got fastest lap to keep Checo from the Grand Slam. I just sent you guys a link to a picture of Max sitting in Checo's winner's spot in the cool-down room.
Yeah, with Max's seat in the other, his helmet in the other seat.
Right. So, I mean, I'm just curious, when Max asked his team what the fastest lap was, and they came back and said, we're not worried about that, but he goes, well, I am. Obviously, that's Max the competitor, but do you think there's still any lingering Checo-Max issues?
I mean, Checo didn't know that he didn't get the fastest lap until DC asked him in the post-race interview. He's like, Checo, you were leading the world championship for about a lap or so until Max crossed the finish line, or, for 5 seconds. And he's like, huh? He didn't know it.
Right.
So, yeah, you brought it up, and I always listen to Max, but because Checo was close, I was kind of listening to – there's a lot going on. I was listening to both of them while chatting with you guys and watching watching the main broadcast. But, yeah, at some point they were running low 32s. They were instructed to run 33 flats. Max pushed in at 32.6. Checo's then instructed to run at 32.6. He asked why at 32.6. Well, because that's what Max ran. He's like, well, I was told 33.0. He's like, well, Max was told 33.0 as well. So they start pushing again, and then Checo at some point when they're running about 32.2s says, like, can we stop pushing? And Max is like, can we keep pushing? Because I don't know if that was, maybe my Max bias is saying that Checo was starting to push to a speed that was uncomfortable to keep maintaining or not. But yeah, Max was nursing an issue. He closed it within 4 seconds. He jumped up to 6.5, and he ended up blistering out like a 31.9 for the fastest lap. But they also said that I think 7 of the drivers finished the fast lap with their fastest lap. So, like, why didn't you just do that a little bit longer and see if you could have passed other people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the grid now. I mean, it's interesting, and I'm curious if this is going to be a pattern that happens. There was a lot of teams, back-to-back spots. Aston sort of is the exception just because of the DNF from Lance, and maybe it would have been that way if he'd finished P4 if he didn't have the DNF. But you've got Red Bull 1-2, obviously Fernando, and I guess this changed a little bit with the penalty. But then you had George and Lewis within a couple seconds of each other. You had the Ferraris within a couple seconds of each other. The Alpines within a couple seconds of each other. The HAASes within 6 seconds of each other, split by Yuki. So I'm just curious if this is sort of a, we kind of know what the cars are now in a way. I mean, I do think the bottom half of the midfield has shuffled a lot compared to last year. mean, Matt, you talked about the stat during the race. Now the Haas has a point. There's two teams without a point, and it's McLaren and Alfa Romeo, or is it Alfa Romeo? Oh no, it's AlphaTauri. Yeah, AlphaTauri.
Yeah, because Joe scored last week.
That's right. So Matt, I do have a question. How do you feel if you're Lando right now?
I'm starting my getaway bag. Like, I'm starting to throw some things like in there. Like, like when your wife's having a baby, so you like got that like prep bag, like whenever it's just like time to go, you just got it sitting there in the closet. Like I think he's got one of these bags. He's starting to throw some stuff in there. There's no way with how they started these first two races that he has to in the back of his head. And if it's not him, whoever he trusts is starting to sit there and like, we don't need to extend. We need to start prepping ourselves for, I think he has one more year there. I think next year is his last year of his contract, I believe. After that, he's like, where can we start to slowly put ourselves into a better situation? Because McLaren's not it. And I don't think they finished 9th or 10th, but they're not finishing in the top half, at least with all these issues that they're having. And Lando is too talented of a driver, and he's still young, but he's also getting to the point where he's going to be at his peak, and he cannot sit there and stick. He's got to be starting to look elsewhere.
Yeah, I wonder if Lando, for every race, at least the next few races, is just going to leave a suitcase in the garage. Like, guys, I'm ready to pack my shit if y'all don't figure this out. Just leave it there. Like, don't even say anything. Just, it's there. It says Norris on it. That he's like, if y'all don't figure this out, I'm out of here.
It starts off like empty, and then like after each like screw up, he's like he throws in a pair of like a shirt or some shorts. He just slowly starts adding things in there, and he's like, if it gets above this line, like I'm done. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
It is not pretty for and Stin, you kind of you said this all in these previews that we did, right? Like, some of these teams, you're going to see the effect of the wind tunnel and the regulations, and out of anybody from a negative standpoint, it has just reared their ugly heads against McLaren. And
yeah,
for a fun team and a fun, young, talented team, it sucks to not see them competing. But Lando's got to be 1 foot in and 1 foot out at this point.
Trivia question. Lando's suitcase, what is it?
Samsonite?
Like brand?
Mm-hmm.
OGO?
Toomey. If you guys go, Brady, you're local to Atlanta as well. If you go to the Avalon and you're walking through the strip place, you walk past the Toomey department store or whatever, the store, you've got pictures of Lando Norris holding his Toomey bag walking out. So he's got a Toomey bag sitting, waiting in the garage right now, ready to roll out and stay at a Hilton property on his way.
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't be a worse start. And it's too bad Cole isn't here to get his kind of sadness or hear his sadness with McLaren. I mean, if there's any positive, so I know, Oscar Piastri made Q3 this week, which is huge. That was definitely a surprise. I know they talk about his talent, but we've yet to be able to see it, right? I mean, last week he had an issue, or I keep saying last week, Bahrain, he had an issue. So his race was cut short. This week on the first couple of turns, he and Pierre, little contact, so he had to change the wing on lap 1. But then he did pass Lando on track today. I mean, they were on different tires at the end of the race, but I really hope sooner than later he gets a chance to have a clean race and we actually get to see what he can deliver, because the signs point to him being a pretty fast driver. Zach even come out and said he's a future world champion. So, yeah, I don't know. I hope at least beginning in Australia that there's some positive moments for McLaren, because it's been a pretty awful start, to say the least. So, anything else to touch on the race? I mean, there was a nice little scrap there at the end between K-Mag and Yuki for the last point. I know once K-Mag finally made the pass, we had a nice little radio yell from Yuki, his disappointment. No! Yeah, that's all that was. But other than that, not a great race for Alfa Romeo. I mean, Bottas was well behind. He was the only driver to get lapped this week, so not sure what happened there. The Alpines seem to have recovered nicely to finish 8th and 9th. Ferraris were kind of quiet doing their thing. I mean, Haas was 10th and 12th. So, yeah, I mean, overall, not a whole lot of drama. Again, 2 weeks, 2 races, no crashes. So, that has, changed things a bit. We've had either just pure pace or reliability issues change up the order. So, anything else you guys want to touch on?
Just one more thing I read that there was a statement, I don't know who it was from, but that said that Fernando was told to get a 5-second gap with like 2 or 3 seconds left or 2-3 laps left, which again felt really strange that would have happened 27 laps earlier or so. But there was another statement that said that he wasn't warned about that 5-second until 3 laps left. He had time in hand to be able to clear a 10-second gap, but because he was never told, he didn't.
Yeah, again, I mean, hopefully they figure out a way to sort of resolve that quicker, because you never know. I mean, you're right. Maybe he would have stretched that out and still stayed on the podium. But for now, it's a Checo 1, Max 2, George 3. No 100th career podium for Fernando, but maybe that comes in Australia. I will say this. I do think, I know the race today wasn't super dramatic, but I love Saudi. I love the test for the drivers. Qualifying is awesome just because it's high speed. I know they made some changes to make it a little bit safer and add some better, sight lines. I'm excited to race it this week on our F1 2023 Twitch race on Wednesday night, so check us out. Matt, I'm sure you're excited about that one.
Yeah, it's not going to go well. You said there have been no crashes in real F1 races the first 2. I'll have about 7 in Saudi itself. It really is. It is a very cool track. It's a fun track. There's really no track like it anywhere else on the calendar. Like, you can kind of compare some tracks to others. A handful or have similar feels to it. But at the speed of Saudi and the tightness and just the amount of high-speed turns, nothing really compares to it. So it's always a fun test to see these guys go out there and see how they attack it.
Well, you have Sector 1 in Saudi Arabia feeling very much like COTA Sector 1 or Japan Suzuka Sector 1, but you have a wall.
Right.
3 meters or so off of, if even that, between 1 meter and 3 meters off of those very fast rolling turns. But it's super rewarding if you nail it. But if you don't nail it, especially on our video game, I can't imagine how it is in real life. You ruin the entire lap.
I mean, it's terrifying. You see these guys come around, some of these turns, and they are that far from the wall. I mean, just how talented they are to hit, where they need to hit to be able to get the speed they need to get. It's got to be terrifying to an extent at times for them.
Yeah, the part of the track, 22 and 23, that left to right swooper where, people missed a couple of times, especially early in free practice and during the race. The ability to know that you're not going to make the turn and to go right, but then there's the wall, get back left, and then turn right on the track is just phenomenal. So kudos to these guys. They're obviously world-class drivers. That's pretty obvious. And look, I mean, we're early in the season, but no one's really made glaring mistakes. Mick crashed here last year with a pretty bad and expensive wreck. So good on everyone for, making it through Saudi. We've got 1 week off, and then we go down to Australia, which is another great track. We saw the changes last year to Sector 2, which increased the high speed there. So let's look for Red Bull to win by 40 seconds in Australia in a couple weeks. Hope not. But yeah, so that wraps up a quick edition of the Slipstream podcast for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Catch us on Wednesdays on our Twitch race at Slipstream Podcast on Twitch. And of course, we'll be back with an episode coming up in a couple of weeks as we recap the Australia Grand Prix. Peace.
Thanks all.